1v1. A reference to 1 versus 1 competitive formats, differentiating them from larger multiplayer formats with more than 2 players. 1 + 1 + 1 = 7. A reference to Tron decks where, once you've assembled all 3 Tron lands, they generate 7 mana total. 2 for 1. An example of card advantage generated by getting 2 cards for the price of 1 card. For example, you use 1 removal spell to kill 2 creatures. Acceleration. Anything that ramps you or otherwise gets you ahead on mana either temporarily or permanently. Ally and enemy colors. A reference to the back of Magic cards that show the relation of Magic colors to each other, with colors next to each other being known as ally colors and cards across from each other being enemy colors. Relevant to certain card designs, as many cards will hate on the enemy colors specifically, and usually not ally. Alter. A card that has been customized by painting or sharpieing over it to create a new card design. For example, this Steam Vents was altered to look like a scene from the movie Spirited Away. Answers and threats. A reference to the function of certain cards, with threats being things like creatures and planeswalkers that put pressure on the opponent and can win the game, and answers being cards that answer those threats, such as removal spells. Anthem. Any effect that pumps your entire team of creatures, a reference to the card Glorious Anthem. Archetype. Referencing deck archetypes, meaning the strategy and game plan a deck employs, which are aggro, which is typically fast, aggressive decks that win by attacking with cheap creatures quickly. Combo, which refers to synergizing multiple different cards together in a combination to win the game quickly, either through one back-breaking play or through demonstrating an infinite loop. Control, which seeks to control the game via disruption in removal spells, counter spells, sweepers, and so on, and eventually win in the late game. Mid-range, which is a value-based deck that straddles the line between control or aggro, being either controlling enough to stop aggro decks or fast enough to beat control decks before they take over. Ponza, or land destruction, which is a strategy that employs disrupting the opponent's lands by destroying or exiling them or otherwise rendering them unusable with cards like Blood Moon, typically a kind of mid-range deck. Prison, or stacks, which seeks to set up a lock and for which the opponent cannot escape, such as by preventing them from casting spells or preventing them from tapping their lands for mana. Stacks has multiple possible origins, with some thinking that it refers to the card Smokestack and others that it refers to the slang of stacks, meaning a monetary value. Ramp, which is the strategy of getting ahead on mana quickly with mana dorks or cards that fetch lands from your library or other permanents that add mana such as mana rocks, to employ bigger, more powerful threats earlier than the opponent. Stompy, which is a sort of hybrid between aggro and mid-range that uses larger big creatures at a cheaper rate. And lastly, Tempo, which refers to a sort of hybrid between an aggro and a control deck that uses cheap, efficient creatures combined with disruptive control strategies. The classic example of Tempo is Legacy Delver. Decks also don't have to fall into one specific archetype and can be hybrids of multiple archetypes, such as Combo Control, which is a control deck that has a combo finish. Attrition. Winning the game via small, incremental value over time rather than big, flashy plays and bombs. Auto Loss. Playing a matchup that is so horrible or against a card that is so bad for your deck that it's basically an auto loss, meaning you auto lose to the card or deck. Bad Beat Story. Regaling the story of a loss to your friends about how you lost to variants, being outplayed, misplaying, etc. Bait. Using a card to bait out an answer, for example, casting a threat and hoping that your opponent will counterspell it so that you can cast another threat that you actually want to resolve more. Bear. A reference to the card Grizzly Bears, meaning a 2-mana 2/2 creature. This can also just refer to any 2-mana creature with 2 power. Beatdown. The concept of describing who's on offense and defense. For example, the player being attacked is being beaten down, and the player who's attacking is on the beatdown. Beater or Beatstick, referring to a creature that's good at attacking, usually for a high amount of damage. Bin. Referring to putting a card into the graveyard, usually from your hand or library. Blink or Flicker. Exiling a creature from the battlefield and having it return immediately, or in the case of flickering, returning it at the end step, although blink and flicker can sometimes be used interchangeably. Blow Up. A term for destroying a permanent. I cast a Braid and blew up his artifact. Blowout. Referring to when you get set back significantly on card advantage or board presence. I blocked his attacking creature with 3 creatures and he gave it death touch before damage was done. It was a blowout. Board presence. Referring to the amount of resources you have on the battlefield, usually creatures. A player with a good amount of permanents or creatures, or whose creatures and permanents have high value, has a good board presence. Board state. Referring to the collective position of the battlefield at the time, taking into account all of your permanents and all of your opponent's permanents. Board wipe, sweeper, or wrath. Any spell or effect that destroys, exiles, or otherwise gets rid of all of the permanents or creatures on the board, with Wrath referring to the card Wrath of God. Body, referencing the collective power and toughness value of a creature, can also refer to stats, meaning the power and toughness. A creature's base stats are their power and toughness before any modifiers are applied, such as pump effects. Bolt, short for lightning bolt, but can also be used as a verb meaning to bolt something. Bolt the bird, referencing the cards Lightning Bolt and Birds of Paradise, meaning that the value that a Birds of Paradise gives by ramping the opponent earlier means that you should always bolt it if you can. A general heuristic used to refer to any situation where you want to destroy a mana dork or mana acceleration. Bomb, also called a finisher, meaning any permanent, usually a creature that acts as a single game-winning threat in itself. Bounce, the act of returning a permanent from the battlefield to its owner's hand. Bracket, referencing the total win-loss ratio of players in a tournament. For example, anyone with 2 wins or 3 wins but 2 losses is in the X2 bracket. Also sometimes used to refer to something else. For example, a player who shows up late to the tournament and gets a loss would be referred to as being in the traffic bracket. Bread, an acronym used as a heuristic when drafting to determine what cards you should draft in what order. B stands for bombs, R stands for removal, E stands for evasion, A stands for abilities or aggro, and D stands for dudes or duds. This means that when drafting, you should prioritize drafting bombs first, then removal, evasion, and so on. Brew, to come up with a new deck either from scratch or by iterating on an existing deck. The process is referred to as brewing, and a player who does this as a brewer. If you're only iterating on an existing deck or just trying to hammer out the edges and optimize it, you could be referred to as tuning the deck and be a tuner. Brick, when a card with a random chance element fails to achieve success. For example, I cast Collected Company, but I didn't find any creatures with it, so I bricked. Broken, refers to a card that is too powerful and will probably wind up being banned. You could also say that you're trying to break the format by coming up with a deck that is far more powerful than the other decks that currently exist. Build around, a card or package of cards that warrant building a deck specifically around that card or package to take advantage of its value. Bulk, cards that are basically worth nothing are referred to as bulk. For example, a rare that is not very good could be a bulk rare, or a garbage rare, or a trash rare. Burn spell, any spell that does direct damage, usually a red spell. Butt, refers to a creature with high toughness, usually if it's larger than its power. A creature like Elishnorn, for example, could be said to have a big butt. Cantrip, a spell, usually a cheap one, that draws a single card, thus replacing itself, examples being Ponder or Preordain. Card advantage, a concept in which one player gains more cards than the other player, or when someone is able to use one card to generate more than one card. Card pool, refers to the collective available legal cards in any given format. For example, the standard card pool usually only contains cards from the previous 2 years. Cascade, specifically refers to the Cascade mechanic, but any effect that does something similar, meaning you reveal or look at cards from the top of your deck until you find a specific card, can be referred to as cascading, meaning you cascade into the card. For example, Indomitable Creativity technically doesn't have Cascade, but you might refer to it as cascading into Archon of Cruelty. Charms, or modal cards, refers to any card that lets you choose between multiple options and is a reference to the original Charms. Chase Rare, the most highly desired, most sought-after rare in the set, could also refer to a non-rare card, meaning that it's a chase uncommon, for example. Checkmate, when you move your pieces into a position which threatens the king and your opponent has no outs. Wait, wrong game. Cheese, winning or gaining advantage in an unorthodox way. Chump Block, blocking with a creature with far lower stats than the creature it's blocking, meaning it's just going to die, done to prevent damage. Clock, refers to putting pressure on a player. For example, I'm attacking with this creature, it will kill them in 3 turns, so they're on a clock. Can also refer to the literal clock on Magic Online. CMC, an abbreviation for converted mana cost, meaning the total mana that it takes to cast a spell. The term converted mana cost has since been replaced by mana value, but many players still use the abbreviation CMC. Color combinations. Color combinations have various names in Magic. Sometimes they're used, sometimes they're not if it sounds less natural. The names are Azorius for blue-white, Boros for red-white, Dimir for blue-black, Golgari for green-black, Gruul for red-green, Izzet for blue-red, and Izzet also sounds like Is-It and is used in many puns, Orzhov for white-black, Rakdos for red-black, Selesnya for green-white, and Simic for green-blue. There are also names for the 3 color combinations. First are the Shards, which is a reference to Shards of Alara where these names were first introduced, which are Bant, Esper, Grixis, Jund, and Naya. Next come Wedges, which refers to the shape that is generated by looking at the back of a magic card, since they look like a cheese wedge. These are Abzan, previously known as Junk, Jeskai, Mardu, Sultai, which is often just said as Bug, and Temur, which is often said as Rug. There are no names for 4+ colors, but these are generally referred to as 4-color sans whatever color is missing. So for example, Atraxa would be a 4-color card sans red, and WUBRG, which references a card that is all 5 colors, taken from the abbreviations for the magic colors. Color Pie, referencing the available mechanics and abilities that colors get. When looked at on a graph, it appears as a pie chart, thus the name the Color Pie. A card that does something that's not supposed to be in the colors that it is would be referred to as a Color Pie Break, or a Color Bleed. Combat Trick, an instant speed spell that's used to pump a creature or otherwise give it an ability that makes it more valuable in combat. Combo, short for combination, meaning when combining 2 or more cards to create a powerful effect. And this is where combo decks get their name from. Combos are different than synergies, where synergies usually just refer to cards that are enhanced by combining multiple cards, but not necessarily in a way that immediately wins the game. Examples would be that Gift Storm is a combo deck, but Affinity is a synergy deck. Comp, short for compensation. For example, if a judge refereeing an event is being paid $100 by the store, that's their judge comp. Constructed and limited. Constructed refers to formats where you purposely build a deck ahead of time and then come to the tournament with that deck, and is sometimes referred to as 60-card formats to refer to competitive formats versus more casual formats like Commander. Limited refers to a format where you build a brand new deck from cards that you open on the spot. Examples are Draft and Sealed. Crack, a verb meaning to use something, such as cracking a fetch land, cracking your artifact egg, but it can also refer to cracking open a pack, and some players refer to the game as cardboard crack because of how good/addictive it is. Crackback or swingback refers to the concept of how much damage you're liable to take if you attack with all of your creatures and thus have few or no blockers when the opponent can attack you the next turn. For example, I don't want to attack because I'm worried how much damage I'll take on the crackback. Cube, a unique custom set that a player makes by combining cards from various sets together and is usually drafted. Cubes are typically 320 to 540 cards to accommodate 8 players for a draft. Curve refers to the collective and distributed mana values of all the cards in your deck, minus lands. Good curves are typically seen as ones that let you play spells on each turn, so they have a bell curve shape going from 1 mana up to however much the highest mana in the deck is. Curve Out, the optimal play pattern of a deck that plays a spell each turn for the maximum amount of mana that it can, usually refers to aggro decks. For example, they played a 1 mana spell on turn 1, then played a second land and a 2 mana spell on turn 2, then a 3 mana spell on turn 3 with their third land, thus they curved out. Cut or shave, referring to removing cards from a deck. Cutting being removing the card completely, and shaving meaning reducing the amount of copies to less than the amount that were in there previously. Cycle, taken from the mechanic cycling, meaning to discard the card to draw another card, or refers to a cycle of cards from a set. For example, cards that appear in multiple colors and do similar things. Primeval Titan, Sun Titan, Frost Titan, Inferno Titan, Grave Titan. Dead card, a card that is basically useless given either the board state or its inability to do things given the cards you have. I drew this removal spell, but since my opponent's deck doesn't have any creatures, it's a dead card. Dead on board, being in a position to lose the game based solely on the board state of your opponent. Deck out, running out of cards in your deck and being susceptible to losing by having an empty library. I got down to 0 cards and decked out. Deck thinning, the process of reducing unwanted cards in your deck by searching them out with other cards, usually in reference to fetch lands. The math has been done and it's inadvisable to fetch solely to thin your deck unless you're literally going to lose and the life total doesn't matter. Dies to Doomblade, a term which argues against the common misconception that creatures are bad just because they die to removal spells. For example, Baneslayer isn't a bad card just because it dies to Doomblade. Dig, trying to find specific answers in your deck by drawing more cards. Direct damage, referencing burn spells and dealing damage outside of combat. Disruption, the act of limiting, reducing, or otherwise interfering with the opponent's game plan. For example, removal spells disrupt creatures, cards like Thoughtseize disrupt their hand, and so on. Documents, official game documents available online used to understand the rules of the game, how to run tournaments, policies, and so on. Some of the most important ones are the Comprehensive Rules, a roughly 278-page document detailing all the rules of the game in intricate detail. The Magic Tournament Rules, which describes how to run tournaments and tournament policies. and the IPG, or Infraction Procedure Guide, which describes what the violations of rules and policy by players at tournaments are, and the appropriate penalties and fixes for them. Draft Chaff. Cards of a sufficiently low enough power level that they're basically useless in constructed formats and may only be middling in limited. Drain. Any effect that causes your opponent to lose life and you to gain life, usually found in black. Draw Go. A control strategy that basically does nothing on their own turn aside from maybe playing a land before passing, usually just to hold up counterspells. Dredge. Specifically refers to dredge decks or cards with the dredge mechanic, but can be used more generally to describe effects that return cards from the graveyard to hand. Durdle. Taking game actions that basically don't do anything or don't advance the game because the cards that you have essentially don't have any positive effect on the game. Or being out of cards completely. Eat. When one card causes another creature to be sacrificed. For example, I cast Village Rites eating this creature. EDH. Another name for the Commander format, short for Elder Dragon Highlander, and the original name of the format. Distinct from the term cEDH, with the C standing for competitive, where the format is more about extremely competitive, high-skilled play, apart from EDH, which is more about casual play. Edict. An effect that causes the opponent to sacrifice a creature, and a reference to the card Diabolic Edict. Egg. A cheap permanent, usually an artifact, that can be sacrificed to draw a card. Enabler. A card that enables other cards to be used or is otherwise the outlet for them. Engine. A card that enables continuous value in a deck. For example, a draw engine, with some staple cards being things like Jace the Mind Sculptor or Mystic Forge. EOT, short for End of Turn. ETB, short for Enter the Battlefield, usually referencing permanents that have Enter the Battlefield triggers. EV, short for Expected Value, and refers to the collective overall average value in a set or individual pack. For example, the cards in this set are highly valuable, so the set has high EV. Evasion. Refers to the ability of a creature that's hard to block. For example, creatures with flying have evasion. Evergreen. Refers to mechanics that frequently or always appear in sets. For example, flying is in pretty much every set, whereas a mechanic like cycling may only appear in specific sets. Extraction Effect. Any effect that removes specific cards from an opponent's deck, such as Necromentia. The effect is a reference to the card Cranial Extraction. F6. A statement declaring your intent to take no actions during your opponent's turn. A reference to Magic Online, where pressing the F6 button means to pass without doing anything. Face. Referencing the player themselves rather than anything else. For example, Bolt Your Face. A synonymous term is Dome. Pointing burn spells at someone's face is doming them. Can also be referred to as going upstairs for burn spells. I didn't burn their creatures, I pointed my bolt upstairs. Fair and Unfair. Distinguishes between decks that play spells normally, on curve, and which can be interacted with by most opponents, which are said to be fair decks, and decks that exploit combos, synergies, or otherwise get around normal limiting game systems like mana cost, which are unfair. Fair decks are usually in archetypes like aggro, midrange, and control, such as Modern Jund or Legacy Delver, whereas unfair decks are usually combo or ramp, such as Tron or Show and Tell. Fast Mana. Any effect that generates a burst of mana temporarily or even long-term but for a cheap cost. Examples are things like Simian Spirit Guide or Chrome Mox. Fetch. The act of using a fetch land to go find a land in your deck. Fish. Slang for merfolk tribal decks. Fizzle. When a spell fails to resolve for various reasons, such as because its target became illegal. Flample. A creature that has both flying and trample. A Flampler. Flashback. Specifically refers to spells with the flashback mechanic, but can be used as a verb whenever you cast a spell from the graveyard. Flavor. Referencing anything that doesn't have to do with the mechanical aspects of the game, such as story, flavor text, art, and so on. Float. Meaning to add mana to your mana pool without immediately using it. For example, in response to you tapping my land, I'll float mana. FNM. Short for Friday Night Magic, referencing the tournaments that take place at local game stores on Fridays, which often come with special promos. Fog. Any effect that prevents all combat damage from the opponent's creatures, a reference to the card Fog. For the Win. Taking an action that will result in you winning if it succeeds, for example, I attack for the win. Format. A distinct set of cards and a unique ban list that differentiates itself from other formats in the game. For example, Standard, Modern, Pioneer, Legacy, Commander, and Pauper are all formats. Eternal formats are those like Legacy and Vintage that don't rotate and where most cards are legal save for a select ban list. Free Spell. Any spell that you can cast for a cost other than paying the mana for it. Examples are Force of Will and the Evoke Elementals. Gas. refers to the ability of cards in your hand to do things. For example, if the cards in your hand are very good and have lots of abilities, then you'd say that your hand is nothing but gas. Conversely, if you've run out of cards or the cards that you have don't do anything, then you're out of gas. Get there refers to the player who won the match. You'd ask them, did you get there? And if they say yes, it means they got there. Glass Cannon refers to fragile combo decks that can easily lose the game if they're disrupted. For example, Neobrand is a Glass Cannon combo deck. Go ahead or pass. A declaration of your intent to take no further game actions during your turn and thus make it the opponent's turn. Go deep. Building a deck with a very narrow, very niche use case. Go infinite. Being able to demonstrate an infinite loop of game actions that can be repeated over and over. This is usually the end goal of combo decks. Go off. When your deck does the thing that the deck is supposed to do in a way that will probably win the game. For example, when a storm deck assembles all of the necessary storm spells, it has gone off. Go over refers to a situation in which your deck or individual cards in it accrue much more value than the other deck. For example, a ramp deck can go over a mid-range deck. Conversely, going under means trying to win quickly before a player can accrue resources or stabilize, often with an aggro strategy. Go wide. Playing many creatures. I generated 6 tokens, so I've gone wide. Conversely, going tall is when you have a single large creature. God Pack. A booster pack with an exceptionally unlikely and highly valuable set of cards in it. For example, Journey into Nyx had packs that contained all of the gods, and Unstable had packs that contained only full art basics. Goldfish. Practicing playing your deck with no opponent. For example, a combo deck that can win on turn 3 when not disrupted could be referred to as consistently Goldfishes by turn 3. Good Stuff refers to a specific kind of deck. A Good Stuff deck is a deck that doesn't necessarily rely on any synergies or combinations between cards. Rather, the cards in the deck are all individually powerful on their own, so it's a Good Stuff deck. Grind can refer to 2 different things. A grindy game is one that's going to go long and involve a lot of trading of resources and constant rebalancing of who has the best card advantage. A grinder would be a player who consistently plays at local tournaments or bigger tournaments in an attempt to win cash prizes. Group Hug. A style of deck used in formats like Commander that have more than 2 players that involve having everyone gain positive benefits. For example, cards that cause everyone to draw more cards or ramp everybody. Conversely, a deck that causes negative benefits for everyone is referred to as Bear Hug. Hardcast. Paying the full amount on a card that has an alternate cheaper cost. For example, I paid 5 for Moldrifter, so I hardcast it. Hard and soft counters. The difference between a counterspell that counters a spell outright, a hard counter, or one that can be paid for in some way, a soft counter. Counterspell and Dovin's Veto are hard counters, whereas Monoleak is a soft counter. This can also refer to cards that stifle specific decks or strategies in a more or less effective way. For example, Tormod's Crypt would be a soft counter to Dredge since it only exiles their graveyard once, whereas Rest in Peace, which exiles the graveyard permanently, would be a hard counter. Has legs. Refers to when a deck or card is competitively viable. The deck has legs. Hate. A card or type of card that damages a specific strategy. For example, cards like Endurance, Rest in Peace, and Relic of Progenitus are examples of graveyard hate. Hate Bear. 2 mana creatures that have prison-style effects that disrupt the opponent. Examples of Hate Bears are cards like Thalia, Containment Priest, and Gadok Teague. Hate Draft. When you take a powerful card in a draft not because it's useful for you, but because you want to deny it to another player in the draft or don't want to play against it. Hedge. When you make a decision in a game or when deck building that has a generally less powerful outcome than another one you could have made in order to mitigate against something. For example, I'm including this Eldrazi Titan in my sideboard to hedge against Mill. Hellbent. When you have no cards in your hand, is a reference to the original mechanic for the Rakdos Guild. High Flying. A creature with flying that can only block other creatures with flying. It's a high flyer. Hitting Runners. When you draw good cards back to back, often when you're low on resources and the cards are exactly what you need at the time, as in the phrase runner. Hose. When a card severely damages a specific strategy. Rest in Peace hoses Dredge. ID. Short for intentional draw. When 2 players in a tournament intentionally draw with each other, since a draw nets 1 point as opposed to 3 points, but it doesn't matter because they're already at a sufficiently high amount of points that drawing will guarantee they get in the top 8. Impulse Draw. A type of draw effect usually found on red spells in which you don't get the cards long term. For example, they're exiled and you have to cast them within 1 turn cycle. Example cards of this are cards like Light Up the Stage and Reckless Impulse. In the Air. Refers to attacking with a flyer. I attack in the air. Inevitability. A deck's strategy has sufficiently high value that if the game goes long, it has inevitability. Jam. Playing a game or cards specifically in an enthusiastic way. I jam my threat on the field. Let's jam some games. Jank. Something that's usually not very good. This card is jank. Judge. The name for tournament officials who enforce the rules, basically Magic's referees. I will also posit that, like in the animal kingdom where something like a group of crows is referred to as a murder of crows, a group of judges should be referred to as a gavel of judges. Construct. The name for a specific construct token that gets +1/+1 for each artifact on the battlefield. Originally made by Karn Scion of Urza, but has since gone on to be made by a number of cards, with some notable examples being Urza and Urza's Saga. Keyword. An ability or mechanic that is used over and over and is given a name. Flying and trample are keyword mechanics. Kitchen table. Refers to the most casual of settings. For example, players who play at their kitchen table rather than an official tournament at a card shop. Land base or mana base. A reference to the collective amount of lands and what exactly they do in your deck. I'm splashing green, but I have a mostly blue and red mana base. Land categories. Certain groups of lands that all have the same basic abilities and just change which colors they add. Notable examples of these lands are bounce lands, which are the lands that are used in Amulet Titan and are sometimes called Karus, referencing the old card Karu. Check lands. Dual lands, which can refer to any land that produces two different colors, but in specific refers to the original dual lands from Alpha through Revised, like Volcanic Island. Fast lands. Fetch lands. Filter lands. Gain lands. Horizon or Canopy lands, which are in the cycle that Horizon Canopy belongs to. Man lands, which are any lands that can become a creature, such as Inkmoth Nexus, for example. Pain lands. Pathways, which are the modal double-faced lands. Scry lands, which are the temples. Shock lands, which are a reference to the card Shock, since they deal 2 damage to you if you want them to enter untapped. Slow lands. Soul lands, which refer to any land that can produce 2 or more mana, such as Ancient Tomb or City of Traders. Tango or Battle lands, which are the set of ally-colored lands introduced in Battle for Zendikar. Tap lands, which refers to any land that always or usually enters the battlefield tapped. Triomes, which is a reference to the 3-color lands originally introduced in Ikoria and then later Capenna. And Utility lands, which refers to any land that does something other than just make mana. LD, short for land destruction, which is any effect that causes the opponent's land to be destroyed, such as Stone Rain. Land drop, refers to a land that you play once on a turn. I made my land drop. Legal and illegal, refers to whether a card can be used in a format. A card is legal if it's a part of the selected card pool and isn't banned. Also refers to making plays in game that do or don't follow the rules. For example, trying to target a creature with hexproof is an illegal play. Lethal. Any damage that would cause either a player to lose or a creature dealt lethal damage to be destroyed. My opponent is at 5, I attack with creatures that have power 5 or more, thus I attacked for lethal. LGS, short for local game store. Lock. A position in which an opponent is extremely hampered by a prison or stack strategy. A hard lock refers to a position where they are unable to do anything, such as they can't cast spells ever or can't tap their lands for mana. A soft lock is one in which they are sort of locked out of the game but may have outs. Loop. Similar to going infinite. Demonstrating a loop means taking the series of game actions that result in an end state that you can repeat over and over. Loose. An opening hand that is marginal or risky. This hand's not very good, but I'm keeping it, so I'm keeping a loose hand. A player who keeps a loose hand may also say that they are trying it. Can also refer to playing loose, meaning you're not paying much attention or not putting much thought into game actions and making bad plays as a result. Loot and rummage. Looting means to draw and then discard a card, whereas rummage is to discard a card first and then draw. These are references to Merfolk Looter and Rummaging Goblin. Lord. A creature that enhances your other creatures, usually in a specific tribe, and usually by giving them +1/+1. Magical Christmas Land. The concept of a card or strategy that is extremely good, but only in an extremely unlikely scenario. Main deck. Specifically referring to cards in the main deck rather than the sideboard. Make 'em have it. When a threat or play is exceptionally good as long as the opponent can't answer it. I'll go for my combo and make them have it, with it being the answer. Mana abbreviations. Single letters that are used to abbreviate a color. W for white, U for blue because B is already taken, B for black, R for red, G for green, and then there's generic mana, which refers to any other type of mana like 1, 2, 3, X, etc. C also refers to colorless specific mana that was introduced on cards in Oath of the Gatewatch, like Kozilek. Mana Dork. A creature, usually a 1-mana one, that just adds mana. Birds of Paradise is the classic Mana Dork. Mana fixing or color fixing. a card that specifically ensures that you have the right amount or color of mana that you need. Mana Flood, Mana Screw, and Color Screw. Mana Flood refers to when a player draws primarily or only lands and thus can't really do anything because they don't have spells to cast. Mana Screw is the opposite, where they draw primarily or only non-lands and don't have enough mana to cast those spells. Color Screw is when they actually do draw enough lands to cast their spells, but the spells are in a different color than what the lands produce. Mana Rock, an artifact that taps for mana, usually costs 2 or 3. Mana Sink, a spell or permanent with an ability that is significantly enhanced by having a lot of mana to put into it. For example, Walking Ballista is a mana sink. Math is for blockers, a term used for when the attacking player has given up on figuring out the optimal attacks and blocks because it's too complicated and just attacks with everything, meaning the opponent has to figure out the math on what to block with and where. MDFC, short for Modal Double-Faced Card, refers to cards that have 2 sides where you can choose to play either one, which is different from cards that transform. Metagame, the collective position of all the competitively viable decks in a given format, which decks are tier 1 and how they position against each other. Mill, taking cards from the top of the library and putting them directly into the graveyard, is a reference to Millstone. Mirror Match, when players who are piloting the same deck play against each other. Mirror Breaker, a card in a mirror match that is significantly powerful because of that matchup. For example, Emrakul the Promised End is a mirror breaker in Elementals. MTG, the abbreviation for Magic the Gathering. The gathering refers to players gathering to play. MTGA, an abbreviation for Magic the Gathering Arena, one of Magic's online clients. MTGO, an abbreviation for Magic the Gathering Online, Magic's original online client and often shortened to MODO. Mulligan, when a player's hand is bad and they want to redo, they can mulligan their hand. This is often shortened to mulling. Conversely, if they don't want to mulligan their hand, they would keep it. A hand that is good enough to keep and not mull can be referred to as a keeper or keepable. Narrow, a card with a very specific use. Shatter is a narrow card, whereas Abrade is a less narrow card. Natural Tron, sometimes shortened to Nattron, refers to when a Tron player is able to assemble all 3 Urzatron lands without having anything that fetches them like Expedition Map or Sylvan Scrying. Naturalize, any effect that can destroy artifacts or enchantments, a reference to the card Naturalize. Net Deck, copying a deck that a player finds online rather than brewing it themselves. Card Nicknames, various staple cards throughout the game have nicknames associated with them. Some of the most prominent examples are Bob, which refers to Dark Confidant and is reference to Bob Marr, who is the player who originally designed it. Coco, which is shorthand for Collected Company. EE, which refers to Engineered Explosives. Ewit, which is short for Eternal Witness. Gary, which is a nickname for Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Goyf, which is a shortened form of Tarmogoyf. Labman, which is shorthand for Laboratory Maniac. Mom, which refers to Mother of Runes. Primetime, which refers to Primeval Titan. RIP, short for Rest in Peace. Sad Robot, a reference to Solemn Simulacrum and its original artwork. Scooze, shorthand for Scavenging Ooze. And Steve, which refers to Sakura Tribe Elder. Nonbo, when 2 cards actively work against each other in the same deck. Rest in Peace and Ren and 6 are a non-bow, because Rest in Peace means that you can't activate Ren and 6 for any value. Nut Draw, when a player's opening hand or sequence of draws is incredibly powerful or even the most optimal way that they could have drawn the cards in their deck. My opponent comboed off on turn 1, it was a Nut Draw. On a Stick, when a creature is notable mostly for its ability, especially if that ability shares similarities to a famous spell. For example, Grief is a Thoughtseize on a stick. Onboard Trick, a permanent on the battlefield with an activated ability that can be used at instant speed and often affects combat, and is clearly visible to all players. On Curve, playing a spell with a mana value equal to the maximum value that could be played assuming you've played 1 land per turn. For example, playing a 3 mana spell on turn 3 is playing it on curve. On the play or on the draw, refers to the player who's going first and going second. The player who's going first is on the play, and the player who's going second is on the draw. One of, a card that's run as only a single copy in the deck. A 2 of would mean there are 2 copies, 3 of is 3 copies, and 4 of is 4. Opener or starting 7, synonyms for a player's beginning hand of 7 cards. Outlet, any card that acts as the end goal or enabler for other cards. For example, you could say something like Putrid Imp is a discard outlet in Reanimator. Outs, being in a disadvantageous position and trying to find specific cards that will prevent you from losing. This can be referred to as playing to your out. Overextend, when you commit more resources to the board than you need to and become vulnerable as a result. For example, if you're playing an aggro deck and your opponent has sweepers, playing more and more creatures could be said to be overextending into a Wrath. Package. A group of 2 or more cards that synergize with each other specifically but not necessarily any other cards in the deck and can often be slotted into multiple decks. Stoneforge Mystic and her equipment would be an example of a package. Paper. Paper magic referring to physical, real cardboard cards in real life as opposed to digital ones on the digital clients like Modo and Arena. Payoff. A card that acts for the endpoint of having to jump through a bunch of hoops to get to. Big, powerful creatures like Gristlebrand are the payoff for playing Reanimator. Pile. For example, 4-color pile, refers to generally good stuff decks that are simply a pile of the best cards that you can play in a number of colors. Pile shuffle. A method of shuffling in which you place cards down individually one at a time and then group them all together rather than something like riffle shuffling. This method doesn't actually randomize the deck and isn't sufficient alone, but it can be useful if you, for example, had all of your cards in the same order. Pimp Out, or Bling Out. When a player upgrades the cards in their deck to be the most expensive and most premium versions available. For example, the Artifact Masterpieces from Kaladesh, or the Expedition lands from Zendikar. Ping. To deal 1 damage to something. A permanent that can continuously deal 1 damage to something by activating an ability is referred to as a pinger. Pip. Refers to a specific mana symbol on a card. For example, Chandra Torch of Defiance has 2 red pips. Pitch. When you have to discard or exile a card from your hand to pay the cost of another card. For example, the card that you exile with Force of Will is pitched to it. Play around. When you actively play around a specific card or strategy that your opponent is employing. For example, they have 2 open blue mana, so I'm playing around Counterspell. Play pattern. The common sequence of plays and interactions between cards and decks. Playable. A card is of a sufficient power level that it's playable, which usually means that it's not that good, but it's playable. Player psychographics. Psychological templates for players of Magic the Gathering originally invented by lead designer Mark Rosewater. These are Johnny, who enjoys creativity such as building wacky combo decks. Spike, who enjoys demonstrating mastery and competitiveness. This is often exemplified by grinders. And Timmy, who enjoys flashy, big experiences, and is exemplified by more casual players. 2 more psychographics were later added, which are Vorthos, who's a player who enjoys the flavor and story aspects of the game, and Melvin, who's a player who enjoys the mechanical and game design aspects of the game. Playset refers to having a full 4 copies of a card. Pod. The group of players, usually 8, in a draft. If the players in a draft are going to play against players from another draft, that's called playing cross-pod. Point. Another term for targeting something. I'll point my removal spell at your creature. Poke. To attack a player or planeswalker with a weak creature, usually only 1 or 2 power when they can't block it. Power creep. Refers to the escalating power level and value of cards as the game continues to be printed. Power 9. A set of 9 cards considered to be extremely powerful from the original set of Magic. These cards are the 5 Moxen, Black Lotus, Time Twister, Time Walk, and Ancestral Recall. Pressure. When a player is under the gun, often from an aggro deck, combo deck, or specific threat. The player on the back foot is under pressure and their opponent is applying pressure. Pro Tour, short for Promotional Tour or Professional Tour, refers to some of the highest level competitive events in Magic for which players have to qualify and which involves most of the professional players in the game. Proxy. When a player uses an obviously fake card in a non-competitive setting as a replacement for a real card, usually because it's too expensive. For example, sharpieing a basic land or printing out a piece of paper with the card on it. Pull. Refers to the cards that you get in a booster pack. For example, I opened this pack and pulled a card. Can also be referred to as opening a card or group of cards in a pack or limited tournament. Pump. Boosting the power or toughness of a creature. Might of Old Krosa is a pump spell. Punt or misplay. Making a mistake in a game. Race. Trying to accelerate your game plan to beat your opponent before they can beat you. For example, a damage race is one where each player has creatures that can't be blocked very well by the other player, so they attack each other as fast as possible, hoping to win the race. Rainbow. Refers to something that's either all 5 colors or is able to make all 5 colors. A spell that costs all 5 colors would be a rainbow spell. Rare draft. When you take a rare card in a draft because it's valuable rather than because it'll be good in your deck. Reach. The ability of a deck to win with specific cards that go beyond something basic like combat damage. Specifically, this tends to refer to burn spells, so a deck like Burn has Reach. This is distinct from the keyword mechanic of Reach. Reanimate. An effect that moves a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield and is a reference to the original spell Reanimate. Recursion. Being able to reuse resources from the graveyard. For example, Moving a card from the graveyard to your hand could be recurring it. Red deck wins. A slang term for red aggro decks because usually red aggro decks are competitively viable in any given format, so if you're unsure what to play, you can just play red aggro because red deck wins. REL stands for Rules Enforcement Level, describes how penalties and fixes for violating the rules will be applied at different kinds of tournaments. Regular REL is for more casual settings like Friday Night Magic, for which things are lax and penalties are rarely if ever applied. Competitive REL, or Comp REL, is for more competitive tournaments like qualifying events and Grand Prix, in which players are expected to know and follow the rules, and in which penalties and harsher fixes are given for violating them. And Professional REL is for the highest levels of play such as the Pro Tour, and is essentially a stricter version of Comp REL. Removal. Any spell that destroys, exiles, or otherwise gets rid of a permanent. Usually refers to things that hit creatures specifically, but doesn't have to. Reps. Getting in practice with a deck. For example, I played this deck 30 times to get practice with it, so I put in 30 reps. Reserved list. A certain selection of Magic cards ranging from the original Alpha set all the way up to Urza's Legacy, which the company has promised never to reprint for financial reasons. Reserved list cards represent some of the most expensive cards in the game because of their scarcity, and are the primary barriers to playing formats like Legacy and Vintage. Response. Taking an action in response to something your opponent does. For example, in response to you casting this spell, I'll counterspell it. Rip. Getting a card when you're in top deck mode, meaning you ripped it off the top. Usually in a situation where you desperately need that card. I was about to lose, and then I ripped this bomb. Ritual. An effect that adds a temporary amount of mana to your pool, a reference to the card Dark Ritual. Robots. A term for aggressive artifact-based decks like Affinity. Rogue deck. A deck that's either a new brew or is otherwise outside of the accepted metagame. Roll for first. The act of rolling dice to determine who's on the planned draw. For example, odd-even or high roll wins. Rotate. Refers to when cards or sets in an ever-changing card pool rotate out. For example, Standard only has the previous 2 years of cards legal in the format, so cards that are older than that rotate out. RTFC. Short for read the effing card. Usually refers to when you're unsure about what a card does or you have misconceptions, you're told to just RTFC to figure it out. Sack. Short for sacrifice. I sacked my creature for this effect. Salty. A player who's become visibly aggravated or annoyed, usually because they're losing, is salty. Sanctioned and unsanctioned. A tournament that complies with the rules and policies of Wizards of the Coast can be sanctioned, meaning it counts towards a store's metrics and may qualify participating players for promos, qualification for another official tournament, etc. An unsanctioned event is one that doesn't comply with WotC guidelines, such as allowing proxies. Sandbag. When you have a spell you could cast, but you intentionally hold back for later, sometimes as a bluff or sometimes because there's a more optimal time to play it. Scoop. Meaning to concede the game and refers to when you scoop up all the cards off the table. Shark. A player highly obsessed with winning the game to obtain prizes, often at the expense of having fun. A player who tries to do things like rules lawyer or angle shoot would be considered sharky. And speaking of, angle shoot. When a player attempts to use the rules to gain an advantage, often by claiming that their opponent didn't say something or should have said something or did say something, and calling a judge over to enforce it. This is usually considered bad sportsmanship. Shatter. An effect that destroys an artifact named after the OG card. Shell. When you have a card or package of cards that needs to be built around, you could say that the rest of the deck is the shell around it. I took this package of Stoneforge Mystic and Cauldra and put it in the Jeskai control shell. Ship it and ship the turn. Refers to 3 things. Shipping it or shipping the turn means to end your turn and make it the opponent's turn. You've shipped the turn. Shipping it can also refer to when you pass a card in a draft, or when you choose to put cards you're selecting from back into or on the bottom of your library. For example, if you scry a card to the bottom, you've shipped it to the bottom. Shock. To deal 2 damage to something, referencing the spell Shock. Shortcut. When you take game actions that are technically incorrect and out of sequence in order to save time. I'll crack this fetch land and cast this tutor, and I'll just search for both cards at the same time. Side in and side out. The act of sideboarding, moving cards in between the main deck and sideboard between games. Signal or telegraph. Sending out implicit signals, either intentionally or otherwise, about what cards you have in your hand or what you're trying to do. Can also be referred to in drafting when you are taking cards of a specific color, the player next to you is signaled that you're in those colors and not to take those cards. Signpost Card. A card, usually an uncommon, in limited formats that signal what kind of strategy those colors use. For example, a green-white uncommon that is about tokens could be a signpost that green-white makes tokens in this set, and that you should draft cards that either make tokens or are good with tokens. Silver Bullet. Usually a sideboard card that is specifically good against a particular archetype. Chalice of the Void is a silver bullet against Cascade decks. Singleton. A format where you're only allowed to use one copy of any given card rather than 4, such as Commander. Slow Roll. When you have the ability to win, but you intentionally delay doing so. Snap Keep. When an opening hand is so good that you keep it immediately without having to consider it. Snowball. When a player reaches a state where their resource advantage generates more and more resources, a player in this state who overpowers their opponent via the lopsided resources has snowballed out of control. Sorcery-Speed. Any effect or spell that you can only cast or activate at the same time you could cast a sorcery, meaning usually in your main phase. Spec. Short for speculate, meaning to speculate on a card or product's financial value by buying it and hoping to resell it later at a higher price. Spell. Technically, in the Magic rules, a spell is anything that is on the stack, but when deck building, players usually have a distinction between creatures, spells, and lands, meaning in this context, a spell is anything in your deck that isn't a creature or a land. Spellslinger. A type of deck that plays lots of cheap instants and sorceries. For example, Is It Phoenix? Spice. Playing an unorthodox and unusual card. Splash. When you have colors in your deck that are the primary colors, and you have a third or other color that is only a light amount of that color in the deck. Stabilize. When you're on the receiving end of an aggro deck beating you down, and then you manage to do something like kill their creatures or gain enough life so that you're not in immediate danger of losing. You've stabilized. Staple. A card that is very good and is in at least one popular deck in a format. A staple that appears in multiple formats is a multi-format staple. Steal. Any effect that causes you to gain control of a permanent that the opponent controls. Storm. Referencing the storm mechanic and refers to any situation where a player plays an exorbitantly abnormal amount of spells in the same turn. A player doing so is storming off. Storm Scale. A scale created by Magic's lead designer Mark Rosewater to describe the likelihood or unlikelihood of any specific mechanic ever appearing on cards. Named after the mechanic Storm because Storm cards were historically very broken. Strictly better or strictly worse. When a card is basically just better or worse than another card in every or most circumstances. Scavenging Ooze is strictly better than Grizzly Bears. Strip Mining and Wastelanding. The act of destroying an opponent's land with either literally the card's Strip Mine or Wasteland, or an effect that does the same thing. I cast Avalanche Riders and Strip Mined my opponent's land. Super Friends. A type of deck that plays a large amount and variety of Planeswalkers. Sure, or It's Good. A statement made when an opponent takes a game action, such as casting a spell, which signals your intent not to respond to it and that it resolves. They cast a spell and you say sure or it's good. Swing. The act of attacking. I swing with my creature. Attacking with a lethal amount of creatures would be swinging for lethal. Tank. When a board state or the next series of actions you need to take is very complicated, or making a wrong or right choice will determine the winner of the game. You take a long time to think about it. A player who's taking a long time to think without performing any actions could be said to be in the tank or tanking. Tapped out. A player has tapped all of their lands and are thus tapped out. This can also be referred to as shields down, whereas if they have open mana, meaning that their lands are untapped, their shields are up. Tax. Any effect that causes casting a spell to be more expensive, examples being cards like Thalia or Trinisphere. Tech. Specific innovations in deck building and card inclusions, often in the sideboard, that make a deck better or more valuable in the metagame or in specific matchups. The Rock. Slang for any green-black mid-range deck. Thoughtseize. Specifically refers to the hand disruption card Thoughtseize. However, the card is so ubiquitous that the term is expanded to mean any spell that lets you look at the opponent's hand and remove a card from it. Tick up or tick down. When you activate the ability of a Planeswalker that either adds loyalty counters or removes loyalty counters, you're ticking it up or ticking it down. Tier. The relative ranking of decks in a metagame. For example, the best decks in the meta are considered to be Tier 1 or A tier. Tilt. When a player becomes emotionally upset to some degree, either because of misplays, variants, or whatever, and starts playing badly as a result. A player in this state could said to be tilted or on tilt. Time Walk. Any effect that causes you to take an extra turn and is a reference to the card Time Walk. Toolbox. A deck with a suite of cards that can deal with a variety of situations and obstacles, which it can often tutor for. Top 8. The cutoff point after the Swiss rounds in a tournament have ended and result in the final 8 players with the best records playing for who will be the ultimate winner. Clean Cut. When, at the start of the last round in the Swiss rounds of a tournament before the top 8 cutoff, the players with the current 8 best records can all intentionally draw with each other such that no other player can gain enough points to advance past 9th place. For example, at the start of the last round of a 6-round tournament, all the players from 1st through 8th place have at least 12 points or higher, while 9th place and lower only have 9 points at most. Drawing guarantees 1st through 8th place will have 13 points or more, whereas even if the 9th place player and lower wins their match, they'll only reach 12 points. Thus, the top 8 cutoff is a clean cut. Draw into or draw out of top 8. The act of intentionally drawing to guarantee yourself a place in the top 8 is known as drawing into top 8. Sometimes there isn't a clean cut, but the odds of making the top 8 by intentionally drawing are still in a player's favor if their tiebreakers are good enough. So conversely, if a player miscalculates and intentionally drawing causes them to be in 9th place or lower, they've drawn themselves out of top 8. Dream Crush. When a player who is one match away from winning prizes, making the top 8, or qualifying for a more prestigious tournament loses. On the Bubble. The state of a player in a tournament who has a number of wins and losses that means either winning or losing their next match will determine whether they can make the top 8 or receive prizes. A player in this state who fails to make the top 8 due to tiebreakers can be said to have bubbled or missed on breakers. Top Deck. When you're out of options or useful cards and you need something off the top of your deck, it can be considered a top deck. Players who are out of cards could also be said to be in top deck mode. Top down and bottom up. The ways that Wizards of the Coast designs sets either flavor first and then mechanics second, which is top down, or mechanics first and then flavor second, which is bottom up. Trade up or trade down. When you make a play in a game that causes you to be in a more advantageous or less advantageous position. I cast this very cheap removal spell and destroyed their big creature, so I traded up. Tribe or tribal. Usually refers to a deck involving many creatures that share the same creature type and have synergies between each other because of that. Elves, goblins, and merfolk are all examples of tribal decks. Tuck. To cause a permanent to move from the battlefield either to the bottom of the library or shuffled into it. Tutor. Any effect that causes you to search your deck for a specific card, and is a reference to original tutor cards, like Demonic Tutor. Ultimate. The most powerful and often game-winning final ability on a Planeswalker that usually has to be achieved by plussing it many times beforehand. A player who activates an ultimate ability would say they ult it. Value. A descriptor for the worth acquired or generated by a card, game action, etc. A powerful or financially expensive card is high value. 2 for winning the opponent means you got value. Vanilla. A creature that has no abilities. French vanilla refers to only a single ability or an ability that's only relevant once. Variance. Any aspect of randomness in the game, such as what cards are in your opening hand, what cards you draw off the top, what matchups you're placed against, if you have to mulligan, etc. Voltron. Placing resources into making a single creature extremely powerful, such as in a deck like Boggles. This is a reference to the Voltron mecha series. The shortened version Tron is used to refer to the Tron deck that uses the Urza Tron lands, those being Urza's Mine, Power Plant, and Tower. Weenie. Refers to small aggressive creatures, for example a deck like White Weenie. Wheel. Any effect that causes a player to discard or shuffle their hand into their deck and draw a new 7-card hand, a reference to the card Wheel of Fortune. Also refers to when you don't take a card when drafting and it makes it all the way around the table back to you. Whiff. Another term for bricking. I cast this draw spell looking for a specific creature, but I didn't find it, so I whiffed. Win-con. Any card in your deck that enables you to win by itself or as the end result of a combo plan. Win more. A card that is good, but only if you're already winning the game, so it's not useful since you're winning anyway. Windmill Slam. When you top deck a card you need or find a card you want in a draft and immediately slam it down on the table in a big enthusiastic hand motion. Wish. Any card that lets you get a card out of your sideboard, either moving it to your hand or casting it directly. WotC. Short for Wizards of the Coast, the designers of Magic the Gathering. X spell. Any spell with X mana in its cost, such as Walking Ballista for example. Yard. Short for Graveyard. And finally, Zoo. A type of deck that plays a bunch of usually big, stompy-esque creatures that represent a number of different creature types. So that's it, we've made it to the end. Don't you feel more informed?